Hi, Ethan Borzai here to talk about the battles that occurred in Virginia. Now, before we talk about the actual battles, we need to understand why they happened. During this time, there was a ton of infighting between the North and the South because of slavery and how each other side viewed it. And because of this, Virginia decided that it wanted to succeed because of the Battle of Fort Sumter. Also because of this, the western half of Virginia did not want the succession to happen, and so they made what is known today as West Virginia. And as Virginia finally succeeded, the Confederates decided that they were going to move the capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, so that would be a better strategic spot. I was also told by Ryan Lovell, who is the historical commissioner for Aquia in Virginia, explained that they also moved it to Richmond because they had more ports there compared to other bigger cities like New York. The Battle of Bull Run occurred 2 months after the firing of Fort Sumter. After the attack of Fort Sumter, many Union soldiers were incredibly eager to make a march to Richmond. Because of this, many victories that were occurring in the western part of Virginia, as well as the spread for war in the north, finally pushed President Abraham Lincoln to order General McDowell to start an offensive that would hit fast and decisively at the Confederates, so that they can open up a way into Richmond, so that they can quickly and efficiently end the war. The morning of July 21st, General McDowell, with his 35,000 ill-prepared men, went to take on the 20,000 also ill-prepared Union Confederate men. During that morning, McDowell started off shelling the Confederates while Union troops were crossing the river by Sudley Ford so that they could hit the left side of the Confederates. After more than 2 hours, around 10,000 Union soldiers pushed back the Confederates up onto the Henry House Hill. During this time, more and more rebels, which was another term used for the Confederates, were showing up, and because of all the rebels showing up, the Union were having an extremely tough time coordinating assaults from all sides. By late afternoon, both sides had about the same amount of soldiers, and by that time, the rebels decided to do a counterattack on the soldiers and managing to push them away. Here's a picture of a church that was used as a hospital at the time, and on the top right was another picture of some of the fortifications that were used during the battle. The Peninsula Campaign was a major offensive against the Confederate capital of Richmond. The newly appointed General McClellan, who was loved by many men, was also an extremely paranoid person and would often way overestimate the opposing side's army. As McClellan was approved to start the offensive attack, the other Confederates were moving back their armies so that they could have a better defensive position. When the Union inspected the abandoned Confederate place, they found out that they were way weaker than McClellan had originally talked about. It was also showed that a number of cannons that they found ended up being just logs that were painted black, which was also known as Quaker guns. In early April, McClellan, who had around 60,000 troops, was facing Confederates near Yorktown, which was around only 13,000 soldiers. Even with those odds, he decided to wait. And on May 4th, McClellan finally decided to move up on the peninsula, and by the second or third week of that month, he was approaching the capital with around 100,000 soldiers, while the rebels only had about 16,000. And even with this massive gap, McClellan kept asking for reinforcements. Though most of June, the Confederates were planning a counteroffensive, and while this was happening, McClellan was still complaining that he needed more supplies, as he was claiming that he was going against almost 200,000 enemy soldiers, which in reality was about 92,000. And as both these pictures are also showing the battlefield that was happening in the bottom right, and as well as the battle occurring, which was in the top left. The Second Battle of Bull Run was another deciding battle in this war. Abraham already was getting frustrated with McClellan asking for more and more troops, so they decided to recall the army in the Potomac and combine it with another newly formed army, which was under the command of General John Pope, in which they decided to make a combined effort towards Richmond. Knowing that McClellan's army was on its way, Pope realized that they would have a massive numerical advantage against the Confederates. But the rebels wanted to stop that from happening, so they split their army up into two parts, and one would move around the flank, and the other would watch Pope's army from across the river. Although the Union scouts watched the movements of the first half of the army, Pope assumed that they were heading for Shenandoah Valley, but in actuality, they were striking the Union supply base, which was in Manassas Junction, which was around 25 miles behind Pope. Pope then turned his attention to the back flank, which was commanded by Jackson, but they could not find the people who attacked the junction. Also, McClellan still would not send troops to Pope, as he explained that they were vital for defending Washington. Later on, Pope thought they had them on the ropes, and in reality it was the opposite, as Pope was pushed back to Henry Hill, which was the site of the last Bull battle, and after that Pope was utterly defeated, and he finally left. This loss had a massive impact on the North, as their army's morale plummeted to immensely low levels. These pictures also show the battlefield on the top right, and what the battle looked like, which was on the bottom left. The Battle of Chancellorsville was one of the biggest Confederacy wins during this war. Before the battle even happened, there was a lot of changing of the command, and it was now General Hooker who was in command, as he also spent the spring training his troops so that they are better prepared, and as this time his main goal was to capture the Confederate capital once and for all. The numbers on both sides in this battle were about 115,000 Union soldiers to about 60,000 rebel soldiers, which was probably one of the biggest Union advantages in this war. On April 27th, Hooker took two-thirds of his army to try and feign a frontal assault, while the other third would try and cut across from the side and catch them from behind. As Hooker divided his forces, Lee did as well, and having 10,000 to hold Fredericksburg before making the rest of the army confront Hooker head-on, both the armies fought in an open field by a force that was west of Chancellorsville. And despite having a number advantage, Hooker decided to fall back, which would create an opening for Lee to strike. Although it was an amazing victory, it was also the death of Stonewall Jackson. And these both here pictures show the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was the top left, and also the battlefield in which they fought, which is the bottom right. The battles of Cold Harbor were two fights that happened about 2 years apart. The first battle, known as Battle of Gaines' Mill, the battle was the third of the 7 days battles that was happening against General McClellan, whose main goal was to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. And on June 27th, Robert E. Lee's forces decided to go on the offensive against General Porter, who was behind a swamp north of the Chickahominy River. Porter's soldiers withstood many attacks throughout the day, but coming towards the night, around 32,000 rebel troops decided to make a coordinated attack against them, in which it succeeded in driving the Union forces back to Chickahominy. After the battle, the Union lost about 6,800 soldiers compared to the rebels who lost about 8,700. Now, almost 2 years later, in early May, the Second Cold Harbor Battle happened, with Ulysses S. Grant now starting an overland campaign against the Northern Army of Robert E. Lee. A couple battles happened until they landed at Cold Harbor that day. Some Union soldiers captured the intersection of the harbor, and as Grant saw this as an opportunity to take down Lee at the entrance to Richmond. And Grant prepared for his major assault on Lee, and after many days of waiting for reinforcements, he decided to attack, which ended up being a massive disaster. And by this time, when Grant attacked, the Confederates were already ready and stretched, so when Grant attacked, he was met with immense casualties, as the Union lost about 13,000 troops out of the 108,000 he had, while the Confederates only lost about 2,500 out of the 62,000 that they had. The bottom left is showing the battlefield of Cold Harbor, and the top right is showing some of the battles that was currently happening. The Shenandoah Valley, or campaign, was a massive spot for people who were trying to secure it, so they would have the advantage. The South would use this valley to their advantage, so much so that the North named it the Valley of Humiliation. For a lot of the war, the South would use this valley to move north towards Washington, D.C., where on the other hand, if Union forces tried to advance down the valley, they would end up finding themselves further away from Virginia than they had originally planned. Also, for the Confederates, when they would use this valley, they would cross the Potomac River at the split of the Shenandoah River, and it would put them around 60 miles northwest of Washington. As one of the big fights that occurred here, there was when Grant assigned General Sheridan to finally clear the Shenandoah and get rid of the menace of the rebels, as well as stop the South from using its agricultural produce. And like others, Sheridan was very aggressive, and from late September to late October, Sheridan won 3 major battles, which after winning these, the Union finally gave the Union an upper hand for the valley, and that after they got it, they would never give it up. These pictures here show some of the battles that were happening during the Shenandoah campaign, and as well as a battlefield, which is on the bottom right. The Petersburg Campaign. Before the Battle of Petersburg, General Grant had realized that Petersburg was a very vital piece for the Confederates, and that if it was to fall, then Richmond would also soon follow. Grant has spent a lot of May fighting a lot of inconclusive wars, which will also include the Battle of Cold Harbor, which both sides suffered heavy casualties. And in June, Grant started to move his army around Northern Virginia Army and passed the river to where he was advancing on to Petersburg. As Grant was slowly advancing, Lee was racing around to reinforce Petersburg's defenses. The battle truly began when General Smith moved about 10,000 Union troops against the Confederate defenders, and despite having comparably smaller numbers, the Confederates' defenses had held. More Union troops had shown up the next day, and despite many Union attacks, the Confederate line still held. By the middle of June, Grant had almost 100,000 troops, and still almost 20,000 Confederate soldiers held on and was waiting for Lee's reinforcements. Grant had also realized that the defenses were made around Petersburg were way too difficult to attack, so Grant decided to try and starve the rebels. The picture on the top right shows soldiers during the Petersburg campaign, and the picture on the bottom left is the overview of Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg was also shown to have very brutal and long usage of trench warfare, as the front of it would eventually stretch out about 40 miles and have almost 70,000 casualties in the next 10 months. The trench was dug back in 1862 before the siege, and it was designed by engineer Charles Dimmick, who made it a 10-mile U-shape around Petersburg. And also throughout the winter, many of the Confederates were hunkered down in the fortified walls of Petersburg, and since many of the southern railroads and lines were damaged, many troops suffered from hunger and exhaustion, and because of that, many of them have deserted. In the end, many months, the big victory had occurred on April 1st and 2nd at Five Forks, in which Grant attacked Lee southwest of Petersburg, and on April 2nd, another Union general attacked one of the flanks. Although the war was officially over, the final battle occurred at the Battle of Palmito, which was in Texas. Picture on the top left shows all the soldiers next to each other, and the one in the bottom right is the battle as it was occurring. Here are all my citations used for the first half of the slides, as well as the interview that I used to help explain why they would move the Confederate capital. All these citations should also have the same name and battle I used them for. There are citations that were used for the other half of the slides, as well as some of these citations were also used to cite pictures too. These are the citations I used for the pictures. They should be in order of importance and when I use them for each slide. This is also one of the last citations too. Thank you.